Metaphysics is the study of what fundamentally exists. It is not about specific things like trees or stars, but about what it means for anything to exist at all. The term originates with Aristotle's editors, who placed his writings on first philosophy after his writings on physics, hence metaphysics. But the field is anything but secondary. It asks the deepest questions. What is being? What is reality? Are objects ultimately made of substances, properties, or something else entirely? Metaphysics seeks the structures that underlie and make possible the world as we know it, from the persistence of identity across time to the nature of causation, time, space, and possibility. The next concept we will discuss is ontology. Ontology is a central subfield of metaphysics concerned specifically with what exists and in what ways. It asks what categories of being there are. Does only the physical exist? Are numbers real? What about minds, moral values, or fictional characters? Ontology involves an inventory of reality, a classification of being. An ontologist doesn't just ask whether unicorns exist, but whether there are such things as fictional objects. Ontological debates can become highly technical, with arguments about whether composite objects like chairs exist or whether only elementary particles do. Next up is the concept of being. Being is the most fundamental metaphysical concept. Everything that exists in any sense has being. But not all beings are the same. The ancient Greeks distinguished between different kinds of being: substance, form, potentiality. Heidegger famously argued that philosophy had forgotten the question of being itself, that is, what it means to be. To say that something is can refer to existence, identity, predication, or truth, and untangling these senses is a major philosophical task. Being is not a single property shared by all things, but a framework within which things manifest. It is what allows things to appear and have intelligibility. The distinction between existence and essence is central to understanding being. Essence refers to what a thing is, its nature or defining properties. Existence refers to the fact that it is. For example, a unicorn has an essence. It's a horse-like creature with a horn, but it does not exist. For medieval philosophers like Aquinas, existence and essence are distinct in all beings except God. In existentialist philosophy, particularly in Sartre, the order is reversed. Existence precedes essence. This means we are not born with a fixed nature, we must create it ourselves. In this way, the distinction becomes a tool for understanding freedom, contingency, and authenticity. Substance is that which exists independently and serves as the bearer of properties. For Aristotle, substances are primary beings, individual things like a tree or a person. They underlie and persist through change. In contrast, properties like green or tall cannot exist by themselves. In modern metaphysics, the concept of substance has been debated extensively. Is it coherent to posit an underlying thing separate from its properties? Some philosophers adopt bundle theories that deny the need for substances, while others retain substance as a metaphysical necessity to ground identity and persistence over time. Without substance, it's unclear how objects endure through change. Accidents are properties that a substance can have or not have without changing its essential nature. For example, the color of a shirt is an accident. It can be red or blue and still be a shirt. In Aristotelian metaphysics, accidents contrast with essential properties, which are necessary for a thing's identity. This distinction is crucial in defining natural kinds and understanding how change is possible. Accidents allow for variation without ontological rupture. However, modern metaphysics questions whether the essential accidental distinction is always clear-cut. For nominalists, there may be no deep metaphysical basis for distinguishing between kinds of properties, only linguistic or pragmatic ones. Universals are properties or qualities that can be instantiated in multiple objects. The color red, for instance, can be present in many apples, shirts, or cars. The philosophical question is, what is red itself? Is it a real entity that exists outside of its instances? Realists about universals, such as Plato, argue that universals are abstract entities that exist independently of particular things. Nominalists deny this, saying that only particular red things exist, and redness is just a word. The issue has implications for logic, mathematics, and the structure of language. Are general terms meaningful because they refer to something real, or are they just convenient ways of grouping particulars? Particulars are individual, concrete entities. Socrates is a particular, so is the Eiffel Tower or a specific grain of sand. Particulars are contrasted with universals in that they are not shared, they are one of a kind. Each particular occupies a specific location in space and time. The metaphysical question is, what individuates particulars? Is it their matter, their properties, or something deeper? Some theories, like bare particularism, posit that there is a substratum or bare particular underlying the properties we perceive. Others argue that particulars are nothing more than bundles of tropes, unique instances of properties. Understanding particulars is essential to making sense of identity, causality, and change. Nominalism is the metaphysical view that denies the existence of universals. According to nominalists, only individual things exist. Concepts like redness or justice are just names we use to group similar particulars. There is no independent entity called redness floating in a Platonic realm. Nominalism was historically a reaction against the excesses of medieval scholastic realism and remains popular today, especially among empirically minded philosophers. However, it faces challenges. How do we explain the shared structure of reality if we deny common properties? Can science or mathematics work without some commitment to abstract entities? Nominalism simplifies ontology but complicates explanation. Realism about universals is the opposing view. That universals are real, abstract entities that exist independently of the particulars that instantiate them. Plato was a paradigmatic realist, positing a realm of forms where the true natures of things, beauty, justice, equality, reside. More recent versions of realism include Aristotelian realism, which grounds universals in the things themselves rather than in a separate realm. Realism helps explain why different things can be similar in a deep, structural way. It supports scientific generalization and the objectivity of properties. But it raises ontological concerns. Where do these universals exist, and how do we know them? Are they discovered or invented? Trope theory offers a third option. Tropes are particular instances of properties. Instead of a universal redness shared by many things, trope theorists say each red object has its own unique red trope. These tropes can resemble each other but are not numerically identical. Trope theory avoids some of the metaphysical baggage of universals while preserving the explanatory power of properties. It allows for a more parsimonious ontology. Everything is built from particularized properties. However, it raises new questions about the nature of resemblance and the identity of indiscernibles. Is resemblance itself a universal, or is it just another trope? Trope theory occupies a middle ground in the metaphysics of properties, combining insights from both realism and nominalism. The next concept is modality. Modality refers to the ways in which statements or propositions can be true or false, not just in the actual world, but in possible worlds. There are different modes of being or truth: possibility, necessity, and contingency. A necessary truth is one that could not have been otherwise, like 2 + 2 = 4. A contingent truth is one that happens to be true but could have been false, such as, the sky is cloudy today. Philosophers like Leibniz and Kripke used possible world semantics to rigorously explore modality. Modal realism, defended by David Lewis, holds that all possible worlds are as real as the actual world. Others find this ontologically extravagant and instead adopt modal anti-realism or ersatism. Understanding modality is essential in metaphysics because it governs how we talk about causation, laws of nature, and even identity over time. The next concept is possible worlds. Possible worlds are hypothetical scenarios used to analyze modal claims. When we say something is possible, we often mean it could occur in some possible world. These are not alternate universes in the physical sense, but complete ways the world could have been. Possible world theory helps philosophers evaluate counterfactuals, statements about what would happen if things were different. Saul Kripke and David Lewis revolutionized analytic metaphysics with their use of possible worlds to explain necessity, identity, and reference. Some philosophers take possible worlds to be abstract constructs, others treat them as concrete realities. They also raise deep questions about determinism, free will, and metaphysical necessity. The next concept is essence. Essence refers to the set of properties that make a thing what it is and without which it would not be that thing. For example, having 3 sides is essential to being a triangle. In Aristotelian metaphysics, essence is contrasted with accidents, properties that can change without altering the identity of the thing. Essentialism is the doctrine that entities have essences. Kripke revived essentialism in the 20th century by arguing that natural kinds like water have necessary properties, such as being H2O, that are part of their essence. Critics argue that essence is too rigid or metaphysically obscure, but the concept remains vital in debates about identity, classification, and the nature of kinds. The next concept is identity over time. How can an object remain the same through change? This is the problem of persistence and identity over time. If a tree loses a branch, is it still the same tree? What if it loses all its leaves? Philosophers distinguish between numerical identity, being one and the same thing, and qualitative identity, sharing properties. Some propose endurantism, the view that objects are wholly present at each moment in time. Others propose perdurantism, the view that objects are extended in time like they are in space and have temporal parts. The ship of Theseus thought experiment is a classic illustration of this problem. Identity over time is crucial in metaphysics because it underpins our understanding of personal identity, causation, and moral responsibility. The next concept is time. What is time? Is it a substance, a relation, or a mental construct? Philosophers have long debated the nature of time. The A theory holds that time flows and distinguishes between past, present, and future as objectively real. The B theory treats all points in time as equally real and views temporal relations like earlier than or later than as fundamental. McTaggart famously argued that time is unreal because the A series is contradictory. In modern physics, time is often treated as a dimension similar to space, which raises questions about whether metaphysical intuitions about temporal passage are illusory. Time is central to understanding causation, change, and possibility. The next concept is space. Like time, space has been a central concern in metaphysics. Is space a container in which objects exist, absolutism, or is it a set of spatial relations among objects, relationism? Newton defended the absolute view, while Leibniz argued for relationism. Kant saw space as a form of intuition, a necessary condition for human experience. In contemporary metaphysics, debates about the ontology of space intersect with physics and cosmology. Are points in space real entities? Can two things occupy the same place? Is space granular or continuous? These questions impact our understanding of motion, geometry, and the structure of physical reality. Up next is causation. Causation is the relation that connects events in a way that one brings about the other. But what is it exactly? Hume famously argued that we never observe causation itself, only constant conjunctions and temporal succession. He was skeptical that causation has a necessary connection. Others, like Kant, argued that causation is a necessary condition for experience. In contemporary metaphysics, counterfactual theories define causation in terms of what would happen if the cause did not occur. Regularity theories, interventionist accounts, and process theories each offer different explanations. Causation is foundational to science, moral responsibility, and our understanding of how the world works. The next concept is laws of nature. Laws of nature are the principles that describe the regularities of the physical world. But what makes them laws rather than just descriptions? Are they necessary or contingent? Realists about laws argue that they are more than just summaries of events. They have a governing role. Humans, on the other hand, see laws as mere descriptions of regularities, not necessities. Dispositional essentialists claim that laws arise from the powers and tendencies inherent in objects. Understanding laws of nature is crucial for science, metaphysics, and debates about determinism and free will. Now let's learn about determinism. Determinism is the view that every event is necessitated by preceding events and the laws of nature. If determinism is true, the future is fixed by the past. Classical physics suggested a deterministic universe, but quantum mechanics introduced indeterminacy. Philosophical determinism raises questions about freedom, moral responsibility, and the openness of the future. Compatibilists believe free will is compatible with determinism. Incompatibilists do not. Metaphysically, determinism forces us to confront whether the universe is a closed system and whether randomness or chance can be genuinely real. The next concept is free will. Free will is the capacity to choose among alternatives and act according to one's own reasons. It is central to ethics, responsibility, and personhood. If all actions are caused by prior events, do we ever act freely? This is the problem of free will. Libertarians argue that free will requires indeterminism and agent causation. Compatibilists define freedom as acting in accordance with one's desires and rational deliberations, even if those desires are determined. Hard determinists deny free will altogether. Neuroscience adds complexity by showing that brain activity precedes conscious decisions, but whether this undermines agency remains debated. Free will remains one of the deepest and most enduring metaphysical problems. The next concept is mereology. Mereology is the study of parts and wholes. It concerns itself with the ways in which entities can be composed of other entities and how those parts relate to the whole they form. For example, what does it mean to say that a table is composed of legs, a top, and bolts? Are these parts fundamental to the identity of the table, or can it remain the same object if some parts change? Mereological questions also explore whether wholes are more than the sum of their parts, or if a whole is nothing but its parts arranged in a certain way. Philosophers debate whether parts must be spatially contiguous or functionally related to qualify as composing a whole. Some mereologists argue for unrestricted composition, that any arbitrary group of objects composes a whole, while others maintain more stringent criteria. This area intersects with ontology, as it forces us to define what counts as a thing and what it means for things to exist in combination. The next concept is haesiety. Haesiety refers to the thisness of a thing, the property or set of properties that make an individual thing uniquely itself. Coined from the Latin haesietas, meaning thisness, the term was developed most notably by the medieval philosopher Duns Scotus. It answers the question, what makes Socrates Socrates and not just any human being? While two things may share all the same properties, qualitative identity, haesiety is that which individuates them beyond properties. They are numerically distinct because of their haesiety. In metaphysics, haesiety plays a crucial role in theories of individuation and identity. Unlike essence, which refers to what kind of thing something is, haesiety captures its unique existence. It's also crucial in debates about possible worlds, where one might ask, could Socrates have existed with different qualities? And if so, would he still be Socrates? According to haesietists, yes, because his haesiety persists. The next concept is supervenience. Supervenience refers to a dependent relationship between sets of properties. Specifically, a set of properties A supervenes on another set B if any change in A properties necessarily implies a change in B properties. For example, mental properties are often said to supervene on physical properties. That means if two beings have identical physical states, they must also have identical mental states. Supervenience is a crucial idea in philosophy of mind, ethics, and metaphysics because it allows philosophers to maintain dependency without reduction. It provides a way to say mental properties depend on physical ones without claiming they are physical properties. There are several forms: weak, strong, and global supervenience, each specifying how tightly connected the dependent properties are. The concept offers a nuanced way to describe layered realities where higher-level truths rest upon lower-level structures. The next concept is tropes. In metaphysics, a trope is a particular instance of a property. Unlike universals, which are repeatable and can be instantiated in many objects, tropes are unique to the object they inhabit. The redness of this specific apple is a trope. It is a particular red, not the general universal of redness. Trope theory avoids commitment to abstract universals by positing that what we call properties are really just particularized qualities that belong only to one object. This approach also helps with the problem of individuation, as each object is a bundle of tropes. Trope theorists often adopt a bundle theory of substance, suggesting that objects are nothing more than a collection of co-occurring tropes. The theory also influences debates on similarity and causation, where resemblance between tropes replaces the invocation of shared universals. The next concept is four-dimensionalism. Four-dimensionalism is the view that objects are extended not only in space but also in time. On this view, objects are space-time worms with temporal as well as spatial parts. This contrasts with three-dimensionalism, which holds that objects are wholly present at every moment of their existence. Four-dimensionalists argue that just as we accept that objects have different spatial parts, like a chair has a back and legs, we should also accept that they have different temporal parts, like a child is a different temporal part of an adult. This view helps address puzzles about identity through time, such as the ship of Theseus. It also aligns well with the physics of spacetime and relativity theory, where time is treated as another dimension. However, critics argue it leads to counterintuitive consequences, like making people collections of time slices rather than unified beings. The next concept is bundle theory. Bundle theory suggests that objects are merely collections of properties or tropes bundled together. According to this view, there is no underlying substance or substratum holding these properties together. An object is its properties. For instance, a red round ball is nothing over and above the properties of being red, round, and solid occurring together. Bundle theory provides a way to avoid mysterious metaphysical entities like bare particulars, which are supposed to underlie all properties without having any of their own. Critics challenge bundle theory on grounds of identity and persistence, asking how we can distinguish between two identical bundles or how bundles persist through change. Still, the theory remains a powerful account of objects that aligns with empiricist and nominalist perspectives in metaphysics. The next concept is bare particulars. A bare particular is the metaphysical notion of a substratum or subject that underlies all of an object's properties but has no properties. Imagine stripping away all of an object's color, shape, mass, and function. What remains is its bare particular, the thing that has those properties. This idea is rooted in substance-attribute metaphysics, where substances possess attributes but are not reducible to them. Bare particulars are invoked to explain individuation and the unity of objects over time. However, they are controversial because it is difficult to imagine or define something that exists with no properties. Critics argue they are metaphysical fictions that violate our understanding of what it means for something to exist. Nonetheless, defenders claim they are necessary to account for what makes an object the same through changing attributes. The next concept is the identity of indiscernibles. This principle, famously associated with Leibniz, asserts that no two distinct things can have all their properties in common. If two objects are indistinguishable in every way, then they are not two objects, but one and the same object. This principle challenges the possibility of perfect duplicates and supports a strong principle of individuation based on properties. The identity of indiscernibles has implications for metaphysics, logic, and physics, especially in quantum mechanics, where particles may seem identical in all measurable respects. Critics often raise the counterexample of Max Planck's symmetrical universe, two identical spheres in an otherwise empty universe, which appears to violate the principle. This prompts ongoing debate about whether space-time location or relational properties count as genuine differentiators. The next concept is universals. Universals are properties or relations that can be instantiated in multiple places at the same time. For example, the color red can appear in a rose, a stop sign, and a fire truck. The metaphysical question is whether universals exist independently of their instances, and if so, where and how. Realists argue that universals are abstract entities that exist outside space and time, either in a Platonic realm or as immanent in objects, as Aristotle suggested. Nominalists deny their existence, claiming that only particular things exist and that redness is just a name we give to similar experiences. Trope theorists offer a middle ground by positing that shared properties are actually bundles of resembling tropes. The debate over universals touches on fundamental issues in ontology, language, and epistemology. The next concept is substratum theory. Substratum theory posits that objects are composed of a substratum or substance that holds properties together. According to this view, properties like redness, roundness, and mass inhere in an underlying entity that itself has no properties but provides the unity and identity of the object. This substratum is distinct from both the object and its properties, yet it is what makes the object one thing rather than many. Substratum theory is often invoked in response to the problem of change. How can an object remain the same while its properties change? The substratum is what persists through these changes. Critics argue that substrata are mysterious and unknowable since they cannot be observed or described apart from the properties they supposedly unify. Still, the theory remains influential in traditional metaphysics, especially in substance-attribute ontologies. The next concept is nominalism. Nominalism is the metaphysical view that denies the existence of universals and abstract objects. According to nominalists, only particular things exist, and what we call universals are merely names or labels we use to group similar particulars. For example, when we say that two apples are red, a nominalist would argue that there is no abstract entity called redness that both instantiate. Rather, they are just two similar objects to which we have assigned the same term. This view stands in contrast to realism, which holds that universals have a real, independent existence. Nominalism simplifies the ontology by avoiding commitments to abstract entities, but it faces challenges in explaining how different objects can be meaningfully grouped, or how we can make sense of statements about properties, laws of nature, and mathematics. There are different forms of nominalism, including resemblance nominalism, which explains universals in terms of networks of resemblances, and predicate nominalism, which focuses on the linguistic aspect of categorization. Nominalism remains a powerful and widely discussed alternative in metaphysics. The next concept is essentialism. Essentialism is the belief that certain entities have a set of attributes that are necessary to their identity and function. These essential properties are what make an object or being what it fundamentally is, and without them, it would cease to be that kind of thing. For example, essentialists might say that being rational is essential to being human, or that having three sides is essential to being a triangle. The concept of essence dates back to Aristotle, who distinguished between essential and accidental properties. In metaphysics, essentialism plays a central role in discussions of modality, identity, and the nature of kinds. It is closely related to the idea of natural kinds, where entities like gold or water are thought to have intrinsic properties that define their category. Critics of essentialism argue that it can lead to rigid, overly deterministic thinking, especially in the context of social categories like gender or race. Nonetheless, essentialism continues to be a major viewpoint in contemporary metaphysics, particularly in metaphysical realism and philosophy of biology. The next concept is accidental properties. Accidental properties are those properties that an object can have or lack without affecting its identity. For instance, a car might be red, but it could just as easily have been blue without ceasing to be the same car. This contrasts with essential properties, which are necessary for an object to be what it is. The distinction between essential and accidental properties is central to Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he emphasizes that not all attributes are equally fundamental. In metaphysical analysis, accidental properties are useful for understanding the nature of change, since an object can undergo changes in its accidental properties while remaining the same entity. The notion also figures in modal logic and metaphysical necessity, helping to distinguish between what is necessarily true and what is contingently true. The ability to separate what must be from what merely happens to be is crucial in many areas of philosophical reasoning. The next concept is possible worlds. Possible worlds are complete and consistent ways the world might have been. In metaphysics, they are used to analyze modal claims, statements about necessity and possibility. For example, the claim that it is possible that unicorns exist is interpreted as saying there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. Possible world theory allows philosophers to discuss counterfactuals, identity across worlds, and modal properties with formal precision. Saul Kripke and David Lewis are two major figures in this area. Kripke introduced modal logic semantics using possible worlds, but without insisting on their literal existence. Lewis, on the other hand, defended modal realism, the view that all possible worlds are as real as the actual world. This view is controversial because it drastically expands the ontology, but it provides elegant solutions to problems of modal logic and necessity. The possible worlds framework remains one of the most important tools in analytic metaphysics. The next concept is actualism. Actualism is the metaphysical position that only the actual world, the world we inhabit, exists. Unlike modal realists who believe that all possible worlds are real in some way, actualists argue that other possible worlds are merely abstract representations or conceptual tools. Actualists maintain that we can talk about possibility and necessity without committing to the existence of non-actual entities. For example, when we say that it is possible that a person could have been a musician, actualists interpret this as referring to a certain way the actual world could have unfolded, not a separate, concrete world. Actualism is attractive because it maintains a more conservative ontology while still making use of modal logic and counterfactual reasoning. However, it faces challenges in explaining how we can refer to or quantify over merely possible entities, such as the child a person might have had or the life one might have lived. Different strategies, like ersatz possible worlds or fictionalism, have been developed to address these issues within the framework of actualism. The next concept is modality. Modality refers to the ways in which statements or entities can be necessary or possible. It deals with questions about what must be true, what could be true, and what cannot be true. Modal logic is the formal study of these distinctions, using operators like sac for necessity and tuck for possibility. Metaphysically, modality raises deep questions about the nature of necessity, whether it is logical, metaphysical, or physical. For example, it is logically necessary that 2 plus 2 4, metaphysically necessary that water is H2O, and physically necessary that the speed of light is constant in a vacuum. Philosophers debate whether modal facts are reducible to other facts, or if they are primitive aspects of reality. Kripke's notion of metaphysical necessity, which distinguishes between the essential and the contingent, has been especially influential. The study of modality connects to issues of identity, essence, and counterfactual reasoning, and it continues to be one of the most important and challenging areas in contemporary metaphysics. The next concept is counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are statements about what would be the case if something were different from how it actually is. For example, if Caesar had not crossed the Rubicon, the Roman Empire might never have formed, is a counterfactual claim. In metaphysics, counterfactuals are used to explore causality, possibility, and modal reasoning. David Lewis provided a formal account of counterfactuals using possible worlds. A counterfactual is true if, in the closest possible world, where the antecedent holds, the consequent also holds. Determining what counts as a close world is itself a metaphysical question, involving judgments about similarity and minimal change. Counterfactuals also play a central role in scientific explanation, moral responsibility, and legal reasoning. Despite their usefulness, they are metaphysically puzzling because they refer to scenarios that do not actually exist, raising questions about truth conditions and reference. Nonetheless, they are indispensable tools for philosophical analysis. The next concept is identity over time. Identity over time is the question of how an object can remain the same through change. For instance, if a tree grows taller and loses leaves, is it still the same tree? This issue is crucial for understanding persistence, personal identity, and change. Two main theories address identity over time: endurantism and perdurantism. Endurantists argue that objects are wholly present at each moment of their existence, while perdurantists claim that objects persist by having different temporal parts at different times. The ship of Theseus is a famous puzzle that illustrates the problem. If each part of a ship is gradually replaced, is it still the same ship? And what if the old parts are reassembled into another ship, now which is the original? Philosophers also consider psychological continuity, especially in the context of personal identity. The metaphysics of identity over time intersects with ethics, theology, and the philosophy of mind, making it one of the most enduring questions in the field. The next concept is endurantism. Endurantism is the view that objects are wholly present at each moment of their existence. According to this perspective, a person is entirely present today, just as they were yesterday and will be tomorrow, even though they may change in various respects. Endurantism contrasts with four-dimensionalism and perdurantism, which see objects as having temporal parts spread across time. The appeal of endurantism lies in its intuitive fit with everyday experience. We feel as though we are the same person from one moment to the next. Endurantism handles change by distinguishing between essential and accidental properties, and by saying that an object can gain or lose certain properties while still being the same object. Critics argue that it struggles to account for how identity is preserved through change without invoking mysterious substrata or hidden structures. Nevertheless, endurantism remains a popular view in metaphysics, especially among those who favor a presentist or common-sense ontology. The next concept is perdurantism. Perdurantism is the view that objects persist through time by having temporal parts, slices of existence at different times. On this view, a person is like a four-dimensional worm stretching from birth to death, with each stage or time slice representing a different part of their identity. This theory aligns well with modern physics, especially the space-time model of relativity, where time is treated as a dimension similar to space. Perdurantism offers elegant solutions to puzzles of change, such as the ship of Theseus or personal transformation. It allows for an object to have contradictory properties at different times, e.g., being young and old, because these are properties of different temporal parts. However, critics argue that this view leads to a fragmented sense of self and challenges our intuitions about moral responsibility and consciousness. Despite these concerns, perdurantism provides a powerful and sophisticated model for understanding persistence and identity. The next concept is presentism. Presentism is the metaphysical view that only the present moment is real. According to presentists, past events no longer exist and future events do not yet exist. Only the present is ontologically significant. This contrasts with eternalism, which holds that past, present, and future events are equally real. Presentism fits well with our intuitive experience of time and the idea of temporal flow, but it faces difficulties when confronted with the physics of space-time, especially Einstein's theory of relativity, which treats time as a dimension and all moments as part of a four-dimensional continuum. Presentists often argue from a phenomenological or ethical perspective, suggesting that only the present has value, or that moral responsibility relies on the uniqueness of the now. Philosophers who support presentism often explore how it can be reconciled with physics and whether it offers a more human-centered account of reality. Despite its challenges, presentism continues to be an influential and debated position in the philosophy of time. The next concept is eternalism. Eternalism is the view that all points in time, past, present, and future, are equally real. In this view, the universe is like a block of space-time, where every event exists eternally in its own place along the timeline. Eternalism contrasts with presentism, which holds that only the present is real. Eternalism finds strong support from modern physics, particularly the theory of relativity, which treats time as a dimension like space and allows different observers to experience different nows. Philosophers who support eternalism argue that it offers a more objective and coherent account of reality. However, critics say it undermines our experience of temporal passage and makes the future seem predetermined. The debate between eternalism and presentism raises deep questions about free will, causality, and the nature of temporal becoming. Eternalism also plays a central role in discussions about personal identity, time travel, and the metaphysics of death and persistence. The next concept is growing block theory. The growing block theory is a hybrid view of time that holds that the past and present are real, but the future is not. In this view, the universe is like a block that is constantly expanding. New moments are being added to the block of reality as time progresses. This theory attempts to preserve the objectivity of the past while recognizing the special status of the present and the openness of the future. The growing block theory allows for a kind of becoming that eternalism does not, while avoiding the extreme presentism that denies the existence of the past. Critics argue that the theory struggles to explain the ontological difference between past and present, or why we experience the present as special. Proponents argue that it reflects our lived experience more accurately than either eternalism or presentism, and they explore how it can be reconciled with physics and our intuitions about change and causality. The next concept is temporal parts. The doctrine of temporal parts holds that objects persist through time by having different parts at different times, just as they have different spatial parts in space. This idea is central to four-dimensionalism and perdurantism, where an object is seen as a space-time worm made up of temporal slices. Temporal parts theory allows us to explain how an object can have contradictory properties at different times. For example, a person can be both a child and an adult, but these are properties of different temporal parts. Critics of temporal parts argue that this view undermines the unity of personal identity and turns persons into mere sequences of disconnected events. Supporters argue that it provides the best explanation for persistence, change, and the compatibility of identity with temporal variation. The concept of temporal parts is also relevant to debates in physics, ethics, and the nature of consciousness. The next concept is hexeity. Hexeity, from the Latin hexetas, meaning thisness, refers to the discrete individual essence of a particular thing that makes it uniquely itself. While universals explain what things have in common, hexeity explains what makes each thing different from everything else. This concept was developed by the medieval philosopher Duns Scotus as a way to account for individuation, how two entities that share all the same properties can still be distinct. For example, two identical electrons might have the same mass, charge, and spin, yet they are not the same electron. Hasiety is posited as a non-qualitative property that confers identity beyond shared attributes. In metaphysics, hasiety raises questions about what it means to be a particular, how identity is grounded, and whether individuality can exist without qualitative difference. It remains a niche but provocative topic, especially in the context of modal logic and the metaphysics of identity. The next concept is universals. Universals are properties or qualities that can be instantiated by multiple things. For example, the color red, the shape of a triangle, or the property of kindness are considered universals because they can exist in many different entities simultaneously. The debate over universals dates back to Plato, who argued that universals exist independently of particular things in a realm of forms, and Aristotle, who believed they exist within things as shared properties. In modern metaphysics, realists about universals maintain that these properties are real features of the world, while nominalists deny their existence and see them as mere linguistic conventions. The problem of universals is central to metaphysics because it affects how we understand similarity, classification, and the structure of reality. Are universals entities in their own right, or are they just ways of speaking about patterns we observe? This question continues to spark debate in contemporary metaphysical inquiry. The next concept is particulars. Particulars are the individual entities that instantiate properties or universals. Unlike universals, which can apply to many things, particulars are unique and exist at a specific time and place. For instance, while redness is a universal, a specific red apple is a particular. The study of particulars is crucial to understanding the ontology of the world, what kinds of things exist, and how they are individuated. Philosophers debate whether particulars are bundles of properties or if they have a substratum, an underlying substance that bears properties. Particulars are often contrasted with tropes, which are individual instances of properties, such as the specific redness of one apple. The metaphysics of particulars intersects with discussions of identity, change, causality, and the structure of space and time. Understanding particulars is key to understanding how abstract features are manifested in the concrete world. The next concept is substratum theory. Substratum theory is the metaphysical view that there is a bare particular, a kind of underlying substance, that holds an object's properties together. According to this view, an object is not just a bundle of properties, but also includes a substratum that is itself propertyless, but serves as a support for those properties. For example, a red ball might have the properties of redness, roundness, and solidity, but also an underlying substratum that is the ball itself. The theory is designed to explain how objects can retain identity through change and how different properties can be unified in a single entity. Critics argue that a propertyless substratum is unintelligible or ontologically extravagant, and they often favor bundle theories or trope theories as alternatives. Nevertheless, substratum theory remains a significant approach in discussions of substance, identity, and the metaphysical foundations of objects. The next concept is bundle theory. Bundle theory holds that objects are nothing more than bundles of properties. According to this view, there is no underlying substance or substratum that exists apart from the properties themselves. A particular object is simply the collection of properties it exhibits: its color, shape, texture, location, and so on. Bundle theory challenges the notion of a bare particular and offers a more parsimonious ontology. It also aligns well with empiricism, which emphasizes observation of properties over speculation about unobservable substances. However, critics argue that bundle theory struggles to explain how bundles of properties are unified, how they persist over time, and how two different objects can share all the same properties yet still be distinct, the problem of indiscernibles. Despite these challenges, bundle theory remains an influential position in metaphysics, especially in debates about the nature of objects and the ontology of properties. Next is tropes. Tropes are particular instances of properties, concrete manifestations of qualities that are specific to individual objects. For example, rather than speaking of redness as a universal, trope theory would say that each red object has its own distinct red trope. Tropes are individuated, non-shareable property instances that together constitute the object. According to trope theory, objects are bundles of tropes, and what makes two objects similar is that their tropes resemble one another. This view avoids some of the issues faced by both realism about universals and substratum theory. It offers a middle ground where properties are real but not multiply instantiated. Tropes are particularly useful in explaining the unity of an object's features and in providing a parsimonious account of predication. However, questions remain about how tropes are grouped into objects and how they maintain identity through time. Nonetheless, trope theory has become an increasingly popular approach in contemporary metaphysics. The next concept is essentialism. Essentialism is the metaphysical view that entities have certain essential properties, features that they must possess to be what they are. For example, it might be said that having three sides is essential to being a triangle, or that rationality is essential to being human. These essential properties are contrasted with accidental properties, which an entity can lose without ceasing to be what it is, such as the color of a triangle drawn on paper or the hairstyle of a person. Essentialism has its roots in Aristotelian metaphysics, where the essence of a thing is tied to its purpose or function, its form. In modern metaphysics, essentialism plays a key role in debates about identity, natural kinds, modal logic, and the metaphysics of biology. Critics argue that essentialism reifies categories and imposes rigid boundaries on fluid or socially constructed phenomena. Nevertheless, essentialism remains a powerful framework for thinking about the stability and identity of objects across time and possible worlds. The next concept is accidental properties. Accidental properties are attributes that an entity can possess or lack without affecting its essential identity. For instance, Socrates may have a beard, but he could still be Socrates without one. In contrast to essential properties, which define the nature of an object, accidental properties are contingent and non-defining. The distinction between essential and accidental properties is crucial in metaphysics, particularly in discussions about identity, change, and modal necessity. Understanding this difference helps clarify how something can change over time without becoming a different thing altogether. In modal logic, essential properties are said to be those that an entity possesses in all possible worlds in which it exists, while accidental properties vary from world to world. Critics of the essential-accidental distinction argue that it often depends on linguistic conventions or conceptual frameworks, but the distinction remains a foundational tool in metaphysical analysis. The next concept is modal realism. Modal realism is the view, most famously defended by philosopher David Lewis, that all possible worlds are just as real as the actual world. According to this theory, when we say something is possible, we mean that it actually occurs in some other world. For example, the possibility that you became a musician instead of a teacher is grounded in the existence of a world where that alternative life unfolds. These possible worlds are not abstract or fictional. They are concrete, fully fleshed out realities. Modal realism provides a robust framework for understanding modality, possibility, necessity, and counterfactual reasoning. However, it is controversial due to its ontological extravagance. It multiplies reality into an infinite set of universes. Critics argue that the theory violates parsimony and clashes with common sense, while defenders claim that it provides the best explanatory framework for modal logic and metaphysical necessity. Despite its controversy, modal realism is a cornerstone in the contemporary metaphysics of modality. The next concept is possible worlds. The concept of possible worlds is a tool used in metaphysics to analyze statements about what could be, must be, or might have been. A possible world is a complete way the universe could be, an alternate reality that is internally consistent. While David Lewis famously argued that all possible worlds are real, modal realism, many philosophers treat them as abstract representations or conceptual tools, ersatz modal realism. Possible world semantics is widely used in modal logic to evaluate the truth of modal propositions. For example, it is possible that it rains tomorrow is true if there exists at least one possible world where it rains tomorrow. This framework helps analyze necessity, contingency, counterfactuals, and identity across worlds. The metaphysical status of possible worlds, whether they are real, abstract, or merely linguistic fictions, remains a subject of deep philosophical debate, but their utility in clarifying modal concepts is widely acknowledged. The next concept is counterpart theory. Counterpart theory is an approach to understanding identity across possible worlds. Instead of saying that an individual exists in multiple worlds, counterpart theory holds that each individual has counterparts in other worlds, distinct but similar entities that share important characteristics. This view, developed by David Lewis, helps avoid paradoxes associated with trans-world identity, such as whether the same person can both marry and not marry in different worlds. According to counterpart theory, a person in one world can be said to possibly do something if a sufficiently similar counterpart does it in another world. This shifts the focus from strict identity to similarity relations. Critics argue that counterpart theory undermines the idea of genuine modal predication and fails to respect the intuition that we're talking about the same individual across scenarios. Nonetheless, it remains a central idea in the metaphysics of modality, providing a flexible and nuanced way to handle possibility and necessity. The next concept is deremodality. Deremodality concerns the modal properties of particular things, what is necessary or possible for a specific object. For example, it is necessary that Socrates is human is a deremodal statement because it attributes necessity to a property of Socrates himself. This contrasts with dedictomodality, which attaches modal status to propositions or statements. Deremodality is especially important in discussions of essential properties and identity, as it addresses what characteristics an object must or could have had. The analysis of deremodality raises questions about how we can know such modal truths, and whether they require reference to possible worlds or essences. Some philosophers argue that deremodality implies realism about essences, while others try to explain it through linguistic or conceptual analysis. Deremodality plays a key role in debates about metaphysical necessity, modal logic, and the grounding of modal truths. The next concept is dedictomodality. Dedictomodality refers to modal claims where the modality is applied to entire propositions or statements. For example, it is necessary that all bachelors are unmarried is a dedicto statement because the necessity applies to the whole sentence. This contrasts with deremodality, which applies to specific objects. Dedictomodality is easier to formalize in modal logic and often avoids some of the metaphysical complications involved in deremodality. It is central to understanding logical necessity, tautologies, and analyticity. Dedictomodal logic forms the foundation for many systems used in philosophy, computer science, and linguistics. However, philosophers often debate whether dedictomodality can capture all modal intuitions, especially those involving identity, essence, and particular objects. The distinction between dedicto and dere has become a standard tool in analyzing modal discourse and clarifying different kinds of necessity and possibility. The next concept is logical necessity. Logical necessity is the strongest form of necessity in metaphysics and logic. A proposition is logically necessary if its denial leads to a contradiction, if it is true in all possible worlds. For example, 2 + 2 = 4 and all bachelors are unmarried are considered logically necessary truths. Logical necessity forms the basis of deductive reasoning and is closely tied to the principles of classical logic, such as the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. Logical necessity is often contrasted with metaphysical and physical necessity, which concern different kinds of constraints. The analysis of logical necessity helps clarify the boundaries of what can be rationally conceived, argued, or known with certainty. Some philosophers argue that logical truths are analytic and grounded in the meanings of terms, while others explore alternative logics that challenge classical principles. Regardless, logical necessity remains a cornerstone of metaphysical analysis and formal reasoning. The next concept is metaphysical necessity. Metaphysical necessity concerns what must be the case, not because of logical rules or physical laws, but because of the nature of reality itself. For example, many philosophers argue that it is metaphysically necessary that water is H2O, or that a specific individual could not have had different parents. Metaphysical necessity is often understood in terms of possible worlds. Something is metaphysically necessary if it is true in all possible worlds where the relevant things exist. It goes beyond mere logical consistency and taps into questions about essence, identity, and the structure of reality. Unlike logical necessity, metaphysical necessity allows for the existence of logically possible but metaphysically impossible scenarios, such as a world where water is not H2O, which may be conceivable but not metaphysically viable. The concept plays a central role in debates about essentialism, modality, and the limits of conceptual analysis. It is also closely linked to the work of philosophers like Kripke, Plantinga, and Fine. The next concept is physical necessity. Physical necessity refers to what must be the case given the actual laws of nature. For example, it is physically necessary that objects fall under gravity on Earth, or that nothing can travel faster than light according to relativity. Physical necessity is weaker than metaphysical or logical necessity. It depends on the specific structure of our universe rather than on the nature of concepts or being itself. Something that is physically necessary may not be metaphysically or logically necessary. For instance, different physical laws are logically conceivable. Understanding physical necessity is crucial in philosophy of science, especially in analyzing causality, natural laws, determinism, and the metaphysics of time. Philosophers debate whether laws of nature are contingent regularities, necessary truths, or grounded in some deeper metaphysical reality. The distinction between physical, metaphysical, and logical necessity helps clarify different layers of explanation and the kinds of necessity involved in various philosophical arguments. The next concept is determinism. Determinism is the metaphysical thesis that every event or state of affairs, including every human decision and action, is the inevitable result of preceding events in accordance with the laws of nature. In a deterministic universe, given the state of the world at a particular time and the laws of nature, only one future is possible. Classical physics, especially Newtonian mechanics, was long thought to support determinism, though quantum mechanics has challenged this assumption. Philosophers distinguish between different kinds of determinism, causal, logical, theological, and debate their implications for free will and moral responsibility. If determinism is true, it raises the question of whether individuals can genuinely be held accountable for actions that were bound to happen. Compatibilists argue that free will is compatible with determinism if actions flow from one's internal states and reasoning. In contrast, incompatibilists claim that true freedom requires genuine alternative possibilities. Determinism remains central to metaphysical debates about freedom, agency, causality, and the structure of reality. The next concept is indeterminism. Indeterminism is the view that not all events are determined by preceding causes and natural laws. According to this view, some events occur randomly or probabilistically. Indeterminism is often associated with interpretations of quantum mechanics, where particles can exhibit behaviors that are not strictly determined by prior states. In metaphysics, indeterminism opens the door to alternative possibilities, which some philosophers argue are necessary for free will. However, randomness alone does not guarantee meaningful agency. If actions are uncaused or random, they may seem just as incompatible with responsibility as deterministic ones. The metaphysical challenge is to articulate a model of free will that incorporates indeterminism without falling into arbitrariness. Indeterminism also impacts theories of time, causality, and the nature of explanation. While classical physics favored determinism, modern science has made room for indeterministic models, prompting deep philosophical reflection on whether reality is fundamentally open or closed. The next concept is fatalism. Fatalism is the belief that all events are fixed in advance and inevitable, regardless of human effort or intention. Unlike determinism, which explains inevitability through causal laws, fatalism often derives from metaphysical or theological views that posit fate, destiny, or divine foreknowledge. For example, if a divine being knows the future infallibly, then it may seem that the future cannot be otherwise, raising questions about freedom and contingency. The famous lazy argument against fatalism claims that if outcomes are fated, then effort is irrelevant, which seems absurd. Philosophers have long debated whether fatalism truly follows from foreknowledge and whether future truths imply the fixity of the future. Aristotle, for instance, discussed the sea battle paradox, questioning whether statements about the future are already true or false. Fatalism continues to provoke debate about time, necessity, freedom, and the nature of truth. The next concept is free will. Free will is the capacity to choose among alternatives and act upon one's own volition. It is central to moral responsibility, legal systems, and personal identity. Philosophers have offered various accounts of free will, often falling into three broad camps: compatibilism, libertarianism, and hard determinism. Compatibilists argue that free will is compatible with determinism so long as actions arise from internal motives and reasoning. Libertarians claim that genuine free will requires indeterminism and the capacity for alternative possibilities. Hard determinists reject free will entirely, holding that all actions are causally determined. The metaphysical underpinnings of free will touch on causation, agency, mental states, and the nature of selfhood. Challenges include the problem of luck, how to avoid randomness undermining agency, and the problem of origination, how agents can be the true source of their actions. Free will remains one of the most enduring and contested issues in metaphysics. The next concept is compatibilism. Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are compatible. It asserts that even if all events are causally determined, individuals can still be morally responsible if their actions stem from their desires, intentions, and rational deliberations. This position redefines freedom not as the ability to do otherwise, but as acting in accordance with one's internal states without external coercion. Pioneered by philosophers like David Hume and supported by modern thinkers such as Daniel Dennett, compatibilism aims to preserve responsibility in a deterministic world. Critics argue that this redefinition is insufficient, as it avoids the deeper metaphysical concern of whether individuals could truly have acted differently. Compatibilism thus hinges on how we define free will and what kind of control is necessary for moral accountability. It offers a practical solution that preserves ethical frameworks while accepting a deterministic model of causation. The next concept is libertarianism, free will. In metaphysics, libertarianism is the view that free will exists and is incompatible with determinism. Libertarians argue that agents have the genuine ability to choose among alternatives, and that these choices are not fully determined by prior causes. This view often involves agent causation, the idea that individuals can initiate new causal chains through their own volition. Prominent defenders include Roderick Chisholm and Robert Kane. Libertarianism faces the challenge of explaining how indeterminism can enhance freedom without making actions arbitrary or random. To address this, some theories posit that while the decision-making process involves indeterminacy, it is still guided by reasons and character. Libertarianism preserves the intuition that we are authors of our actions and responsible in a deep sense. However, it requires a robust metaphysical framework to explain how freedom can arise in a universe governed by causal laws. The next concept is hard determinism. Hard determinism is the view that determinism is true and incompatible with free will, and therefore free will does not exist. According to this position, all human actions are the result of preceding causes, and individuals lack the freedom to choose otherwise. As a result, moral responsibility is an illusion. Hard determinism draws support from scientific findings in psychology, neuroscience, and physics, suggesting that human behavior can be explained through causal laws. Philosophers like Baron de Holbach and contemporary thinkers like Dirk Pereboom have defended versions of hard determinism. The view raises profound ethical, legal, and existential questions. If no one is ultimately responsible for their actions, how should society respond to wrongdoing? Critics argue that denying free will undermines meaning, agency, and the basis of human dignity. Nonetheless, hard determinism presents a stark and challenging vision of a causally closed universe. The next concept is moral responsibility. Moral responsibility refers to the status of being accountable for one's actions in a way that justifies praise, blame, punishment, or reward. It presupposes that individuals have control over their behavior and can be expected to act according to moral norms. In metaphysics, discussions of moral responsibility are closely tied to debates about free will, determinism, and agency. Compatibilists argue that moral responsibility is grounded in the capacity for rational deliberation and responsiveness to reasons, even if determinism is true. In contrast, libertarians claim that moral responsibility requires genuine alternative possibilities. Skeptics like Galen Strawson argue that true responsibility is impossible, since one cannot be responsible for the way one was determined to be. The conditions for moral responsibility, such as control, awareness, and voluntariness, continue to be a central concern in ethics, law, and metaphysics. Let's now learn about our next concept, agent causation. Agent causation is the metaphysical theory that individuals, rather than events or states, can be the originators of actions. Unlike event causation, where one event leads to another, agent causation posits that a person as a whole can initiate a new causal chain. This theory is often invoked in libertarian accounts of free will, where it is necessary to explain how an agent can be the true source of their actions in an indeterministic framework. Roderick Chisholm famously described this view as requiring a prime mover unmoved. Agent causation aims to preserve autonomy and responsibility without reducing action to random or mechanical processes. Critics challenge the intelligibility of agent causation, asking how agents can act without being influenced by prior states or causes. Nevertheless, it remains a compelling model for those who seek to ground freedom and agency in the metaphysical nature of the person. The next concept is event causation. Event causation is the standard model of causation in science and philosophy, where one event brings about another according to a causal law. For example, the striking of a match, event A, causes the ignition of a flame, event B. In metaphysics, event causation underlies deterministic models of the universe and is central to explanations in physics, biology, and psychology. It provides a clear framework for understanding regularities and predicting outcomes. However, it has been critiqued for its inability to account for human freedom and responsibility, especially in theories of agency. In contrast to agent causation, event causation does not involve personal initiation or self-determination. Nonetheless, it is widely used in philosophical theories of action, mental causation, and explanation. Questions about the nature, direction, and necessity of event causation remain active topics in metaphysical inquiry. The next concept is substance. In metaphysics, a substance is traditionally understood as that which exists independently and serves as the bearer of properties. Substances are contrasted with attributes or properties which depend on substances for their existence. For example, a red apple is a substance, while its redness, roundness, and sweetness are properties that inhere in it. Aristotle described substances as primary beings, entities like a tree, a person, or a rock. Descartes famously identified mind and body as two distinct substances, res cogitans, thinking substance, and res extensa, extended substance. In modern metaphysics, questions arise about what counts as a substance, whether substances endure through change, and whether they are necessary to explain the world at all. Some philosophers, like Hume, rejected the notion of substance as metaphysically mysterious. Others have tried to reduce substances to bundles of properties or to logical constructions. The nature and necessity of substance remains central to ontological debates. The next concept is bundle theory. Bundle theory is a metaphysical view that objects are nothing more than bundles or collections of properties. According to this theory, there is no underlying substance or bare particular that holds these properties together. Instead, the object is identical with the bundle itself. For example, an apple just is the collection of being red, round, sweet, and so on. Bundle theory avoids positing a mysterious substrate and aligns well with empiricist philosophies, such as those of Hume. However, it faces difficulties explaining individuation. How do we distinguish two qualitatively identical bundles in different locations? Can a bundle exist without a unifying subject? Opponents argue that properties require something to inhere in, while defenders suggest that spatio-temporal relations or tropes can provide this unity. Bundle theory remains a major alternative to substance-based ontology. The next concept is bare particular. A bare particular is a theoretical entity postulated to explain how objects can possess properties while being more than just a collection of them. According to this view, a particular is bare in the sense that it has no properties of its own, but serves as a substratum in which properties inhere. This view is often contrasted with bundle theory. For instance, to explain what makes a red apple a single object, proponents argue that there must be a core thing to which the properties redness, roundness, sweetness are attached. Critics claim that bare particulars are metaphysically obscure or incoherent, since something with no properties seems unintelligible. Defenders like Gustav Bergman and Keith Campbell argue that bare particulars provide a needed foundation for individuation and persistence. The debate continues as to whether such metaphysical entities are necessary or explanatory. The next concept is ontic structural realism. Ontic structural realism, OSR, is a contemporary metaphysical view which holds that structure, not individual objects or substances, is the fundamental ontology of the universe. This view emerged from developments in modern physics, especially quantum mechanics and relativity, where traditional notions of individual particles or objects become problematic. OSR argues that what exists are not discrete things with intrinsic identities, but patterns of relations and structures. The identity and individuality of entities emerge from their place in a relational web. This theory avoids some traditional metaphysical puzzles about identity, substratum, and change, while aligning closely with the mathematics of modern science. Critics question whether relations can exist without relata, entities that stand in those relations. Nevertheless, OSR represents a radical shift in metaphysics toward a structural and relational understanding of reality. Now let's learn about haeseity. Haeseity, from the Latin haeseatus, meaning thisness, refers to the discrete properties or characteristics that make an individual object uniquely itself. The term was popularized by the medieval philosopher Duns Scotus, who used it to explain how two objects can be identical in every qualitative respect and yet be numerically distinct. For example, two perfect spheres may share all their properties, yet still be two different entities. Their difference lies in their haeseity, their irreducible thisness. Haeseity challenges views that rely solely on qualitative properties to define identity. It also plays a role in debates about trans-world identity and modal metaphysics. Critics argue that positing primitive thisness is metaphysically extravagant or unintelligible, while supporters see it as necessary to explain individuation beyond mere properties. The next concept is nominalism. Nominalism is the metaphysical view that abstract entities like universals, numbers, and properties do not exist independently of the mind. According to nominalists, only particular concrete things exist, and what we call universals are merely names or linguistic conveniences. For instance, when we say two apples are both red, we are not referring to a shared abstract property of redness, but using the same term for similar experiences or objects. Nominalism avoids the ontological commitments of realism, but faces challenges explaining shared traits, language, and abstract reasoning. Famous nominalists include William of Ockham, who emphasized ontological parsimony, and later thinkers like Nelson Goodman. The tension between explaining similarity and avoiding abstract entities remains a core issue in metaphysical theories of properties. The next concept is about universals. Realism about universals is the view that universals, such as redness, beauty, or justice, exist independently of particular instances and minds. This position traces back to Plato, who argued that the physical world participates in eternal forms or ideas that exist in a separate realm. In contrast, Aristotelian realism holds that universals exist within things themselves, not in a separate world. Realists argue that universals are necessary to explain similarity, causation, and language. For example, different red objects are red because they instantiate the same universal, redness. Critics argue that universals are mysterious entities that raise questions about their mode of existence and location. Realism continues to be debated in metaphysics, particularly in the philosophy of language, epistemology, and science. Now let's learn about conceptualism. Conceptualism is a metaphysical position that mediates between realism and nominalism concerning universals. According to conceptualism, universals do not exist independently in the world, as realists claim, nor are they mere names, as nominalists claim, but instead exist only within the mind as concepts. Thus, redness or triangularity are mental constructs used to classify experiences and objects. This view maintains a close connection between thought and being, often finding favor in Kantian and scholastic traditions. Conceptualism explains commonality without positing external entities, but raises questions about intersubjective agreement, how different minds can share concepts. It also must address whether concepts reflect reality or merely organize it. Conceptualism remains an influential and moderate position in metaphysical debates about the status of universals. Next up is trope theory. Trope theory is a metaphysical account of properties that views them as particularized rather than universal. A trope is a specific instance of a property, for example, the particular redness of this apple, rather than an abstract shared redness. Tropes are often conceived as abstract particulars. They are repeatable in type but unique in token. Trope theory allows for a middle ground between extreme nominalism and full-blown realism. It explains similarity through resemblance among tropes rather than shared universals. For example, two red apples resemble each other because their redness tropes resemble. Trope theorists argue this framework is more parsimonious and aligns better with concrete experience. However, it faces challenges explaining how complex objects are constituted from tropes and how tropes relate to each other in a unified object. Still, trope theory remains a robust contender in contemporary metaphysical debates. The next concept is identity over time. Identity over time, also called diachronic identity, concerns how objects or persons remain the same despite changes. This issue is crucial in understanding persistence, continuity, and personal identity. For instance, how can a person be the same individual as a child and as an adult, despite vast physical and psychological changes? Philosophers have proposed several theories to address this. The endurance theory suggests that objects are wholly present at each moment of their existence, persisting through time without dividing. The perdurance theory, by contrast, views objects as four-dimensional entities with temporal parts, like a worm stretched across time. Stage theory sees persistence as a relation between instantaneous temporal stages. These views each try to reconcile our intuitions about sameness with the reality of change. Questions of identity over time are central to metaphysics, ethics, and the philosophy of mind. The next concept is possible objects. These are objects that do not exist in the actual world but are nonetheless conceivable or imaginable, such as unicorns, golden mountains, or talking donkeys. Philosophers have long debated whether such non-actual entities have any form of being. Alexius Meinong famously distinguished between existence and subsistence, suggesting that non-existent objects still have a form of being insofar as we can think and speak about them. David Lewis, from a different angle, argued that possible objects exist concretely in other possible worlds. According to his modal realism, a unicorn is real in a possible world where evolution yielded such creatures. This view grants full ontological status to merely possible beings. Critics, however, contend that admitting non-actual objects bloats our ontology and violates principles of ontological economy. The puzzle of possible objects remains central in discussions of modality, imagination, and reference. The next concept is empty names. These are names that appear to refer but have no actual referent, such as Sherlock Holmes or Pegasus. The philosophical challenge is to explain how such names can be meaningful, especially when used in coherent and truth-evaluable sentences. One approach, originating with Bertrand Russell, treats such names as disguised descriptions. For example, the detective who lives at 221B Baker Street. On this account, if the description fails to refer, the sentence lacks a truth value. Saul Kripke's causal theory of reference rejects this descriptivism, arguing that names refer directly via a causal chain of communication. But this leads to difficulty when there is no originating referent, as with fictional or hypothetical entities. Some philosophers suggest that empty names refer to abstract artifacts, while others claim they are mere syntactic placeholders. The debate over empty names ties directly into issues in semantics, metaphysics, and the philosophy of language. The next concept is the existence of fictional characters. Do fictional entities like Hamlet or Frodo Baggins exist in any meaningful sense? On one view, these are merely convenient fictions, linguistic constructions with no ontological status. On another view, advanced by philosophers like Amy Thomason, fictional characters are abstract artifacts created by authors. They exist in the same way that laws or musical compositions do, not as physical entities, but as cultural constructs. If we accept this, we can say things like, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional detective without committing to his concrete existence. But how do we account for properties, persistence, and identity across different adaptations? Can we meaningfully discuss Holmes as the same character in novels, films, and pastiches? The metaphysics of fiction invites us to reconsider the boundaries between imagination and reality, and whether the act of storytelling creates a domain of being that is neither wholly real nor wholly illusory. The next concept is truth in fiction. If fictional characters exist in some sense, can statements about them be true? Is Hamlet is a prince true? In fictional contexts, such statements are often taken to be true within the framework of the story. Philosophers like Kendall Walton argue that fiction operates as a kind of game of make-believe, where certain propositions are true according to the rules of the game. These are not truths about the actual world, but truths within a fictional universe. Yet complications arise when fictional worlds overlap with reality or contradict themselves. Is it true that Sherlock Holmes lives in London? The answer depends on how much we import from the actual world into the fictional one. The question of truth in fiction intersects with semantics, intentionality, and narrative theory. It also forces us to consider whether truth is a single absolute property or a more context-sensitive notion. The next concept is modal realism. This is the view, most famously defended by David Lewis, that all possible worlds are as real as the actual world. In other words, when we say it's possible that you chose a different career, modal realism asserts there is a concrete world in which you did. Possible worlds are not abstract representations or mere ideas. They are fully existing, spatio-temporally isolated realities. Modal realism offers a robust account of possibility and necessity. A proposition is possible if true in some world, necessary if true in all. But this ontological generosity is controversial. Critics argue it multiplies entities needlessly, violating Occam's razor. Others question the accessibility and causal isolation of such worlds. Still, modal realism provides clarity in modal semantics and logic, and forces a re-examination of the nature of reality itself. The next concept is actualism. In contrast to modal realism, actualism maintains that only the actual world exists. All talk of possible worlds is understood as talk about ways the actual world could have been. Possible worlds, on this view, are abstract representations, sets of propositions or descriptions, not concrete realities. This approach is more ontologically conservative, avoiding commitment to an infinity of parallel worlds. But it must then explain how we can meaningfully speak of possibilities and counterfactuals without invoking concrete alternatives. Actualists often appeal to modal logic or the semantics of possibility to handle these issues. Alvin Plantinga, for example, defends an actualist account using abstract possible world semantics to capture modal truth conditions. The debate between actualism and modal realism hinges on the nature of possibility itself. Is it grounded in ontology or in conceptual structure? The next concept is Leibniz's law. Also known as the identity of indiscernibles, it is the principle that if two objects have all the same properties, they are numerically identical, that is, they are one and the same thing. Formally, if A and B share all properties, then A equals B. This principle undergirds much of modern logic and metaphysics. serving as the foundation for arguments about identity and persistence. However, its application can be contentious, particularly in quantum mechanics or cases involving apparent duplicates. Challenges to Leibniz's law often involve modal or temporal properties. If Clark Kent and Superman have different properties, such as being known as a superhero, can they be the same person? The law also runs into trouble with indiscernible particles in physics, suggesting that identity may not always be grounded in qualitative properties alone. The next concept is the indiscernibility of identicals. This is the logical converse of Leibniz's law. If A equals B, then A and B share all the same properties. In other words, if two things are numerically identical, then anything true of one must be true of the other. This principle seems intuitive. After all, if they are the same thing, how could they differ? Yet philosophical puzzles arise in applying this principle to cases involving belief, knowledge, or possibility. For example, Lois Lane believes that Superman can fly, but does she believe that Clark Kent can fly? If Superman equals Clark Kent, then according to the indiscernibility of identicals, she should. But this appears not to be the case, suggesting that identity statements may not be transparent in all contexts. Philosophers use such cases to explore the logic of belief, reference, and substitution, raising deep questions about the interaction between language and ontology. The next concept is the identity of indiscernibles. This is the stronger claim that if two objects share all properties, then they must be identical. It is not merely that identicals are indiscernible, but that indiscernibles must be identical. Leibniz endorsed this view, arguing that two objects differing in no respect are metaphysically indistinct. However, the principle has faced challenges in both metaphysics and physics. In quantum mechanics, particles may share all properties, yet be treated as distinct. Similarly, the thought experiment of Max Planck's symmetrical universe, where two identical spheres exist in a void, suggests that numerical difference can exist without qualitative difference. The principle thus raises questions about what grounds individuation. Is it location, causal role, or something deeper? The final concept in this section is the coincidence problem. This refers to cases where two apparently distinct entities occupy the same space at the same time. For instance, is a statue distinct from the lump of clay it's made of? They share the same matter, location, and shape, yet we treat them differently. The clay can survive being squashed, the statue cannot. Does this mean there are two entities in one place? Philosophers debate whether such cases involve true coincidence or whether our conceptual framework misleads us. Some argue for constitution without identity. The clay constitutes the statue but is not identical to it. Others advocate for mereological essentialism or eliminativism, rejecting one of the entities. The coincidence problem challenges our assumptions about material composition, identity over time, and the boundaries of objects. The next concept is truth and being. In metaphysics, truth is not just a matter of propositions matching facts, but is deeply tied to the notion of being itself. For thinkers like Heidegger, to ask what truth is necessitates an inquiry into the nature of being. Truth discloses being. It reveals what is. This means that truth is not just a static correspondence, but an unveiling. In classical terms, truth was defined as adequatio intellectus et re, the alignment of the intellect with the thing. But Heidegger challenges us to think beyond mere correspondence and consider the conditions under which beings can show up as intelligible in the first place. Thus, truth depends on a prior openness of being. Without this disclosure, no claim could ever be verified or falsified. In this way, truth and being are not merely parallel concepts. They are intertwined at the foundation of metaphysics. The next concept is existential dependence. This is the idea that the existence of one entity may hinge on the existence of another. For example, the smile of a person depends on the person existing, no smile without the smiler. Philosophers distinguish between types of dependence: rigid, generic, and conditional. Rigid existential dependence means that a certain entity cannot exist without another specific entity. Generic dependence means an entity requires some instance of a kind, but not a specific one. This notion is central in debates about abstract entities like tropes, universals, or properties. If properties are dependent on substances, then they cannot float freely in a Platonic realm. The notion of existential dependence helps us map out the hierarchy of beings and understand which kinds of entities are metaphysically foundational. The next concept is ontological commitment. This is the question of what entities a particular theory or worldview says actually exist. Every time you make a claim about the world, you implicitly commit to a certain ontology. For example, if you say that numbers exist, you commit to a Platonic ontology where abstract objects are real. If you believe only in physical things, you deny such commitments. Willard Van Orman Quine popularized this idea in his criterion of ontological commitment, arguing that we should accept as real whatever entities must exist for our best scientific theories to be true. This leads to careful parsing of the logical form of our statements to determine what we're actually committed to. It is a central concern in both metaphysics and philosophy of language, ensuring our theories don't smuggle in unnecessary or incoherent entities. The next concept is Quine's criterion. Famously, Quine declared to be is to be the value of a bound variable. What does this mean? When we formalize statements in logic, we use variables that can range over certain domains. For example, in the sentence, "There exists an x such that x is a number," the x is a bound variable. According to Quine, if you quantify over x in a theory, you are committed to the existence of whatever x ranges over. This forces us to examine our theories rigorously, asking what we're implicitly assuming exists. It's a powerful tool to uncover hidden metaphysical assumptions in even the most abstract domains, like mathematics or logic. Quine's criterion makes metaphysical commitment a matter of formal logic, not just intuition. The next concept is parthhood and mereology. Mereology is the formal study of part-whole relationships. It investigates how things can be parts of other things and what the rules are for combining or dividing entities. Classical mereology accepts axioms like transitivity. If A is part of B and B is part of C, then A is part of C, and reflexivity. Everything is a part of itself. But controversies arise when we consider strange cases like the ship of Theseus, where all the parts are replaced one by one. Does the identity persist? Mereology underpins much of metaphysics, especially in questions of composition, persistence, and identity. It's essential for understanding how complex objects arise from simpler constituents and whether wholes are more than the sum of their parts. The next concept is mereological nihilism. This is the radical view that no composite objects exist. According to this perspective, there are no tables, no trees, no persons, only fundamental, indivisible particles or simples. Everything that appears to be a whole is merely a convenient label we impose on a collection of simples arranged in a particular way. Nihilists argue that talk of objects leads to contradictions or ontological bloat. Instead, they propose a parsimonious ontology where only the most basic entities exist, and everything else is a useful fiction. While counterintuitive, this view forces us to confront our assumptions about what really exists and whether our common-sense world aligns with metaphysical rigor. The next concept is mereological universalism. This is the opposite of nihilism. Universalists claim that any collection of entities, no matter how disparate or unconnected, forms a whole. 3 socks and a star? That's a thing. Your elbow and the moon? Also a thing. While this seems absurd, universalists defend their position by appealing to the need for consistent and unrestricted principles of composition. They argue that drawing arbitrary boundaries on what counts as a whole leads to vagueness and contradiction. Universalism is thus a bold metaphysical stance that expands our notion of being while simplifying the rules that govern composition. The next concept is ontological pluralism. This is the idea that there is more than one way to be. Not all entities exist in the same way. For example, the way a physical object exists differs from the way a number or a fictional character exists. Some philosophers argue that we need different existential quantifiers for different domains. Heidegger, too, was concerned with the being of beings, not just that they exist, but how they exist. Ontological pluralism invites us to expand our categories of existence and avoid the mistake of treating all beings as if they are the same kind of entity. It opens the door to a richer, more nuanced metaphysics. The next concept is the metaphysics of nothingness. What does it mean for nothing to exist? Can nothingness be said to have being? Philosophers like Heidegger and Sartre grappled with this deeply unsettling idea. Heidegger wrote that the question of why there is something rather than nothing is the most fundamental of all. Sartre described nothingness as an active force in consciousness, the ability to negate, to imagine what is not. In metaphysics, nothingness challenges our frameworks. It is not a mere absence, but a concept with structure, implication, and philosophical weight. Thinking about nothingness forces us to confront the limits of language, logic, and thought itself. The next concept is the question of why there is something rather than nothing. This is perhaps the deepest question in all of metaphysics. Why does anything exist at all? Why not just nothing? This question defies easy answers and reaches into cosmology, theology, and modal logic. Some propose that something must exist necessarily. Others suggest that nothingness is unstable or impossible. Still others argue the question is meaningless. But the question lingers, haunting every ontological inquiry. It reveals that our very being is a mystery, one that science may describe but never fully explain. The next concept is metametaphysics. This is the study of the nature, methodology, and limits of metaphysics itself. Just as metaethics investigates the foundation of moral claims, metametaphysics asks whether metaphysical disputes are meaningful, whether they are resolvable, and what counts as evidence or progress in metaphysical inquiry. Some philosophers, like Rudolf Carnap, have dismissed metaphysics as meaningless due to its lack of empirical content. Others defend it as the most fundamental form of inquiry. Metametaphysics thus turns metaphysics inward, asking, what are we doing when we do metaphysics? Are we uncovering truths about reality, or simply inventing new conceptual frameworks? These questions shape how we understand the entire discipline, substance property models. It is a popular framework in analytic metaphysics and continues to be refined and debated.